Right, we are live. Welcome, welcome, welcome to all our viewers far and wide and near in Belize and out there. Um, Heritage Education Network Belize is proud to present our last Garifuna Cultural Project just for November. This is not the end of the project, but just for the month of our November, we are super thrilled to bring you this live with three wonderful ladies. I will be your host for today, and I just wanted to welcome you all. I want to just wait a few minutes, well, a few seconds, for a little bit more viewership, and we will get started. But how are you, ladies, today? Thank you and welcome, and thank you again for being here and being a part of this project.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm happy to be here.
Sarame, thank you.
Conversations like this get my juices going. It makes me excited. So I'm
I
excited.
also want like our viewers to know that we are four women in four different time zones, and so I don't know how we would have done it if we couldn't do it virtually. We have Dr. Yanique Hume, who is in Barbados, Kylie Cayetano, who is in Jamaica, Ferosa Cayetano, who is in Spain, and me, I am in Belize. So this is wonderful.
I gotta love the virtual world
Yes. And
for
not,
some for some things.
in the beginning, I thought it was, very stressful, very hectic to kind of get used to. And now I don't know how we would do any of this without the virtual world.
Yeah, our conversations can be richer and deeper, connecting people who wouldn't normally be able to fly so far for a 1-2 day conference, like what you did this past September, the Heritage Symposium. So,
And that was
thank God
large.
for technology.
Yeah.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think I think people are I don't think we can ever go back to a world without this kind of connection. The world is smaller now than it was
Definitely.
before. And
Definitely feels that way.
it
Small.
does. And I've never met any of these three ladies, but I feel so connected to each and every one of them just for the past few conversations that I've been having with them. It's been a lovely experience. And I
Mm.
can't wait for our viewers to hear all the wonderful knowledge that they're about to get. So,
Yeah.
um, I'll get started. So, this discussion is a very informal discussion with these three lovely women about spirituality, indigeneity, and spirituality. I know that in our flyers and marketing and stuff, we had voodoo spirituality, which is something that we will talk about, but it is not the only thing that we want to talk about. And a lot of it stems from Afro descent spirituality, indigenous spirituality, and so forth. So today I am so pleased to have Dr. Yanique Hume, who is the head of Department of Cultural Studies at the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill, in Barbados. And she specializes in the sacred arts of the Black Atlantic, religious and performance culture of the African diaspora, Afro Caribbean spiritualities. I had came to know about Dr. Hume from one of our indirect volunteers and also a presenter at the Culture Symposium, Ralicia Andrews, who I was talking to her about what I wanted to do for this Garifuna Cultural Project, and she said, I have just a person. And she immediately connected me to Dr. Hume, and I felt so connected and just in awe of all of the work that she has been doing throughout her years. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Hume. I can't wait for this conversation. I'm so excited. Next, we have so I was fangirling over these two ladies since the Culture Symposium. Um, so we have the Garifuna Sistas, Kylie and Ferosa Cayetano, who also did a presentation for us at the Culture Symposium. And I didn't know about these ladies um, prior to the symposium. When they sent their presentation, I was immediately in love with what they were doing. So they have about 23 podcasts about
Yes.
Garifuna spirituality. And Kylie and Ferosa, they both pursue their careers in cultural arts, and they are both just phenomenal women. Kylie is pursuing her BA in entertainment and cultural enterprise management at UWI Mona, and her major piqued her interest in learning more about her heritage. Ferosa Cayetano teaches English in Spain, and her Garifuna heritage has been her anchor while living in several countries. And it is, however, challenging to learn about one's cultural traditions when living abroad. And little is of this knowledge is accessible to, to people. But I also believe that this knowledge is also inaccessible to people here who live here. And so we're trying to change that a little bit, right? And this is
That's
one
the
of the
beauty of
ways.
technology. We are bringing the conversation to those who are searching. We're all
Yes,
searching. yes,
we are. We are. We're soul searching. We were talking about this just yesterday, and I would like to open the floor for your open remarks, ladies. Take it away.
Oh, well, I guess I'll start just with a little libation saying, Wengo mi tutu, ana tutu, tutu laroye, tutu ile, tutu eku, argu babawe. Opening all the path with coolness that we could be joined here across the waters that brought us over to these shores and to the shores that we occupy now voluntarily, recognizing that our journeys haven't always been voluntary. And so I say to all of you, good morning, good afternoon, good night, good evening, joyful rising to us all. May we remember all those who've made the crossing and those who are still making the crossing for the betterment of their lives. To the ancestors, both the known and the unknown, to the named and the unnamed, we stand on your shoulders and we give you thanks always for clearing this path and for allowing this moment of communication to take place, for allowing the vibratory ancestral memories to move through us, through sound, through words, through movement, through gesture, and through the ethos that brings us together as African peoples, as peoples who are grounded in a sensibility of the acknowledgement that we are here and we stand as one, but we walk with 10,000 or more. And so giving thanks to all of those visible and invisible who are with us today. Bongo people, good morning. In the Bantu traditions, Malem, Malem, Malem.
Itala. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So here we are.
Yes.
Thank you for opening with the prayer. Kylie and I just recorded an episode of our podcast before jumping on here, and we have learned the hard way that when we don't begin with prayer, things go wrong. Technology starts to do things. We have to re-record. So thank you for setting the tone and ensuring that all will be well.
Yes.
Oh yes, indeed. And openings are very important, you know, this idea of, and also closing. I've recognized that you'll get invitations. Can you do a libation? I'm like, sure, but who's closing? Right? Because when you open, you're inviting. And
Yeah.
like a circle that has a beginning, it does come to a close. And it's also important that we have a moment where all those we invite, we bid them adieu as well, you know. But to recognize that we're coming from different vibratory realms, you know. Some may be queuing on under in traffic on their phones, and you know, some might be dashing in from work. Some may be, you know, in the midst of completing their homeschooling or preparing for bed. So we're all coming in at different levels, and what those kind of prayers do, even in the context of, especially in the context of ritual, is that they demarcate sacred space. And even in this virtual realm, there is a need to demarcate that space and to separate the space of the now from the space of where we've all been, so that we could all come and seat ourselves in our own power, in our own center, with a sense of gratitude for even having this moment to share space. And so that really is one of the many lessons, I think, even if you do not practice an African-based tradition, there are many lessons, many daily practices, teachings that we could incorporate as part of your liberty. That doesn't require paying any dues. It doesn't require dressing in any way in particular or going through any initiations. It requires an awakening of self and recognizing the place of self within the broader universe, but also a sensibility of that we don't walk alone. And in recognizing we don't walk alone, it's also welcoming and saying, yeah, honoring and recognizing all of the many of which walk with us and with each other. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, what would we like to talk about today?
I was internalizing everything that you were saying. I needed a moment.
Hanging on to every last word, like, okay.
There's a moment, in Jamaica we say when the place get quiet, duppy pass. So, but it's a good thing. No, it's a good thing. It's just
it's a good duppy.
Well, it's the idea that spirit come in, spirit pass, because what it allows for is it's like the stilling of the energy, and to recognize that stillness doesn't mean no motion. It just means that we're at such a high frequency of vibration that what we feel is this quiet. Yeah. And then that allows, it's sublime. I like how Kylie did that. But it's like a veil. It's a veil that we, and it allows for all of those other things that when we're not quiet, we don't tap into it. But when we enter in that space of stillness, it's that sweet space. And all of the possibilities kind of just drop in.
That's so true. I went to see a Bouye a few months ago, Garifuna spiritual leader. I got it. She always does this. Anyway, I went to see a Bouye, and one of the many things that she told me is that when I look within myself, I need to be still. Sometimes I have too much happening around me. I have too many people and voices and music, and I need to just be still and listen to what I hear when in that stillness. Even my mother tells me that sometimes. She's like, you have too much bag of noise and noise and noise around you. And I'm like, I love listening to my music. That's how I go within myself. But sometimes I can recognize the importance of just having no sound and listening to what I do hear when there is stillness. So I resonate with that.
And I would say that there are many people who run from stillness because of what they would hear in the stillness.
Yeah.
That part.
Or feel.
Yeah, the friends that you have to leave, the religion that isn't serving you, no pun intended, the things that are not quite right, that because we all have a knowing, but acting on that knowing.
That's something else.
In a conversation, yes.
Yeah. It's scary. It's scary. It's that moment of recognition, right? Where you are, as you're both saying that's, what do you hear in the silence? And that voice, that's active. The voice isn't like a switch where you turn off and on. The voice is there. It's a constant kind of, and it might manifest in the body as a quickening of the heart or a tightening of the abdomen or a lump rising in the throat. That's all of these kind of physiological things our body does to alert us to something, to remind us, tap into it, tap in. What is this saying? because our body responds, and that's spirit work too, as it goes through you, but it has to manifest in something that we could, in a sense, right? And so for those whose senses are operating within the realm of the five senses and haven't quite tapped into the sixth and beyond, it's those things that we would feel. What do we smell? What do we hear? What do we see? What do we feel? What are we touching? But then spiritual evolution allows you to tap into other, what we would call the astral, that energetic field, the aura. Then, what do we pick up when somebody said, "Boy, me and that spirit don't agree," and you're talking about another person, but they recognize that there's something in that maybe past life experience with that individual, and the two of you just don't agree. You don't know each other.
Can't take them.
Right.
Don't take them myself.
Yeah, and there's something that it doesn't sit right. And if you do not listen to that, that's when you run into trouble. When you run. I have a daughter who's a child of Oya, Yansan, Hekwai. And I'll be driving and I'm thinking, she'd be her head in her phone or in a book or whatever it is. And then out of the blue, I hear her say, "Mommy, don't turn that way, take the next road." And I'm like, "Really?" And she's like, and I've tuned into listening to that because I've taken many roads. When she done telling me take the next road and be in car accident, not myself, but there'll be an accident. I'd be waiting in traffic or some detour, some nonsense. And it's like, yeah, especially with younger people, they tend to be a really incredible conduit for these energies. They're that kind of veil, when it hasn't quite closed yet. So that information is seeping through and they haven't received the information to reject it. And so it comes in and it's very innocent. They're not carrying it like saying, "Oh, I don't know." And they're completely trusting of it, right? They that kind of mental chatter of not believing in what is coming to you. They haven't gotten there yet,
They haven't learned how to doubt themselves.
Exactly. And as parents and as guardians, as aunties, as all the many labels we carry in our lifetime, it's to really try and keep that space open for them as long as we can. That space of innocence, that space of being able to tap into spirit and not be afraid of it, and to recognize it's your greatest ally and your greatest teacher.
I think
And
it's difficult for people to lose the control that they
mm,
have, and how to advise people to lose that control, because that is when you give that space for greater things to happen when you let go of it. Because I have that problem, and so how do you get to that mellow space? And people want to get there but still want to be in control.
you're right. It's releasing the mind. It really is, because a lot of it's a cerebral game when we're like, "Oh, but," and we're second guessing. That's all happening in the mind because our body is saying something else oftentimes. But the mind is saying, "Oh no, but what about," and and you learned this and you were taught that, and so that's why, in the same way that I, in speaking about the practice that you come to, that spirit work is practice. It doesn't just come. It is a pedagogy. It is a training, and it is a self-discipline, and it's a practice. It is with a capital P, uppercase P. It is about when yoginis or yogis speak about coming to the mat. How do you come to your practice? And in a sense, it is an idea of showing up for yourself. And by showing up for yourself, you could also stand in service to others. But you have to show up for yourself first, And the practice is the routine. It is this sense of being present, even when everything else is saying, maybe not today. it's showing up, it's showing up, it's showing up, you know, and doing that work, you know, doing that introspective scan of your interior landscape, seeing where am I, and letting the breath do that work to calm. You know, tapping into the sound. Like right now, the rain is falling on the banana leaves, and it's like, you know. So I'm here, but I'm hearing the you know. So it's like, how do you? Because it makes you more open, and the universe becomes so mystically bountiful when you're open to spirit, because it's like, hey, I hear that, I smell that, I feel that, and it's like, it's
It's like
so,
a fountain.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Tapping into spirit in the way that you just lyrically described
Mm,
may be in a manner that isn't acceptable to society at large.
mm,
So I sort of want to veer into, because we titled this as voodoo spirituality. What do people think is voodoo, and what is it actually?
mm. You know, it's interesting that when I first saw the title, I bristled a little bit, because there's a way that the West, starting with Hollywood for sure,
Uh,
but then how, as people of African descent, we too have absorbed the ways in which Vodou, as a wisdom, an ancient African wisdom system, sacred system, has been maligned, right? So when we think about what it references, Vodou becomes almost the catchphrase for anything that isn't Christian, or anything that isn't Catholic, or anything that isn't what we receive as the proper way to serve the divine. And we know that we live in a universe, in a world peopled with multiple energies. And in some world systems, those energies are divinities. Some of them are ancestral kin. Some of them are the energies that are part of the natural environment, and we give them different names, right? So Vodou, as a sacred system within Haiti, Haiti has its origin in the kingdom of Dahomey as one site. That's not the exclusive and only site. The kingdom of Dahomey being present day Benin. It is a tradition. The word Vodou, Vodou, is a version of the spelling of the Fon word Vodun. So it's Voudoun. Sometimes you might see it spelled with an X. Whenever you see Vodou spelled as voodoo, Voodoo, we know that it's referencing something that no one in Haiti practices and no one in Benin practices. That's a fictive imagination, part of the fictive imagination of a Western curiosity around quote unquote black magic. It's not a sacred tradition of which people who are vaudissants practice. And I say practice because these are embodied systems. You come to know the divine through enacting, through service, through labor, right? Through collective labor and individual labor, you come into contact with the divine universe. And your body is what's put to task through being a portal of communication, through being a medium through which the two realms of existence, the invisible and the visible, become united at the site of the body. So the body, when I say about practice, it's about that kind of mindful ways of which we come to serve the divine. So if there's no accident that when we talk about Vodou ceremonies, they speak of service. It's a service to the divine and a service to the community. Because these traditions are reciprocal, they are based on a principle of reciprocity, that you give, but you also receive. You also receive the blessings of health. Many people don't realize that African sacred systems are rooted principally as healing systems. That is their main purpose, to function in a space of healing. And now, healing doesn't only mean that you're unwell. That's a kind of allopathic version of this distinction between, you're sick and you're well. Healing is this idea of, in my view at least, and I would speak of a collective view of living in alignment, right? So when you are healed, there is a sense that you are living and existing to fulfilling your divine purpose in alignment with the community of elders, the community of all creatures, four-legged, two-legged, winged, those that slither on the ground, that you're occupying a space not in domination, but in integration, that you are one among many. And so when one is feeling out of alignment is when you're actually, that's where problems arise. So it could be the disequilibrium, the dis-ease disease, as we often hear it as. But this dis-ease that we speak about when we think about someone who's unwell could be that there's a psychic, a kind of a rupture that is happening, a spiritual disturbance that manifests physically. It could be a environmental thing that is not syncing with you. Could be you just need to change your bed around, change the energy around, that you're occupying a space that really needs to be cleansed and realigned. So there are different ways of which we come to healing. And of course, what one of the beautiful lessons that abound is the ways in which our gardens, our kitchen gardens, our environment become our pharmacies, right? So this idea of nature has everything in it that is required to heal us. And these elders and these systems that have been, that are ancient in their wisdom, and that's why I don't call them religion. I call them wisdom systems, sacred wisdom systems. Wisdom in that they carry, and this is a very important concept, even within Vodou, is known as connaissance, the knowledge, connaissance, the knowledge that we bring to the practice, to what we share, to what we do. It is training that is oftentimes transmitted through apprenticeship, through a mentorship, through observation, and through embodying. So your body is put through the task of making omero, where you're making the medicinal bush bath, where, and I've seen this time and time again, whether in Brazil, in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Cuba, where elders would send young ones out to look for plants. They'll say, bring back hoja de aire, which is the leaf of life, or what we call wonder world here in Barbados, or paraíso, or so this one plant has many names. I'm seeing it out my front kitchen door right now, window. It's used in many Caribbean households. You have a headache, you take off a piece of leaf of life, you put it on your head, you wrap it with a white cloth, and you just lay easy. This knowledge that enters into our system as folklore, and it's what animates so much of these practices, these wisdom systems, and systems because there's a logic. It's not happenstance. These are very meticulously ordered systems. They have a beginning, they have an end, they have a règlement or règle, right? The rule, there's regulations, there's modes of conduct, there's rules of engagement. Hence, the parts all have to line up, alignment again, for there to be any kind of efficacy in the practice. And these alignments are not individual. It takes that person who sends that child out to go for that plant. And that child comes back with the plant, but along the way realizes, oh dear, I don't know if I know what this plant is. And they come and they start to pick and they ask a question. And that other person or the younger person or another person says, no, that's not the plant. Go around there. Plant looks like this. And they don't necessarily know. Many of them won't know the scientific name, but they'll know the local name, or they know what it looks like, or they know what it's for, right? And they'll instruct this child, and this child will run back and bring in the plant. And then, in the initial stages, 7 times out of 10, it's not the plant, but it's in the doing that they learn. And so they go back out again and they recognize, and it's not just saying that's not the one, it's saying actually this looks like it, but the leaves what I'm asking you to look for, the leaves are flatter, wider, prickly edge. If you rub it, you'll have a little scent of mint, right? So I don't even know how many varieties of basil, right? The thing that makes pesto, people love it, they eat it, they're like, oh my God. But that's one of the most sacred of herbs that we could use to bathe with. I remember in Cuba, I made pesto for a family I was staying with. They thought I was absolutely mad. They're like, what are you doing? That's like, this is what we bathe with. You don't eat that. What are you doing with it? But the idea of that, if you could bathe with it, certainly you could eat it, But there's a way that in certain cultures, certain plants become part of what you use for sarayeye, for cleansing, what you use in a bath, what you use to wash your hair, but not necessarily what you ingest. But I have my loctician friend who's like, if you can't eat it, shouldn't be on your head anyway. Right. And it's that same thing, like whatever you're going to put on your body, you should be able to ingest it, because that is the what is it doing to the rest of you? I'm going all over the place.
No, I actually have a question about that. So you talked about wisdom systems that are supported by logic and rules traditionally.
Yes.
This struck a nerve with me because my sister and I run this podcast where for the past year, we've been speaking to elders mostly about different aspects of our Garifuna spirituality. And in the month of November, we've been talking to millennials, okay? People under 35, people in the diaspora who are experiencing spirit, but they all experience it in ways that are different from what has been traditionally, or what I've heard to be traditional. And we've gotten some pushback as, oh, that's not how no, that's not how it's supposed to be. So in these wisdom systems, would you say there's room for evolution? For example, the eating of the pesto as well as putting it on your head?
Well,
is that okay?
Certainly, there's a beautiful scholar, Jacob Olupuna. He is a Yoruba man, professor of religion at Harvard. And I remember hearing him speak about the logic of the 401. That concept of the and one is what we should hold on to for this notion of the potentialities of evolution. That it's not finite. There's always an and. And the thing is, when we think about how these systems moved across the Atlantic, where, let's say, divinatory practices used, for example, kola nuts within the Yoruba Ifa system. Kola nut was what was used as the prized implement for divining. And upon arrival to the Americas, coming across this kola nut was not as easy, but they did find coconuts, right? And so the adoption of coconut within as what known as obi, and the use of obi, the four cut in fours, like you half it and you take it into 4 quarters, if you will, and being able to throw obi and be able to read it was an adaptation, right? So a lot of what we see as being lukumi practices, for example, in Cuba and its broader diaspora, are adaptations of an original tradition that was never meant to be static, right? So when we consider, for example, in Vodou, the Action de Grâce, when they open up the Vodou ceremonies with a litany of Catholic prayers, you may not find that in Benin, maybe in the Congo, because Christianity predates. I mean, it has an early root in the Congo for sure. But there is this kind of litany of prayers that open up the ceremony. So what we find is that these are systems that are inherently elastic and fluid. They're not at all closed off. And that's one of the kind of takeaways, if we were to say what are some of the differences between African systems of thought and other systems. They're very expansive. And the idea of spiritual power being an expansive power, being a power that is absorbative, that it envelops, it embraces, it includes, it incorporates. And with that inclusion, incorporation, embracing, what is happening to is an adaptation to leave room for these things, for other systems to enter, for other knowledges to enter, to recognize, well, this plant exists here, but it doesn't exist here. But does it show? Is it in the same family, for example? How do they become part of this matrix of healing herbs that we could then use? Yeah, and you see it also in the ways and in dress and different ways of which you see this adaptation take place for sure.
I am so glad you mentioned that, because the three of us, Kylie and Feroz and I, were having this conversation about Garifuna Mass, because I had just attended it last week, and it had all of these indigenous incorporations into a Catholic
Yeah.
structure that is Mass. And the three of us, we were very we had our our comments about it, but I'm glad that you brought this up about assimilation, because we always wondered how it worked, where you would be able to bring in this indigenous tradition with this Christian Catholicism structure, and where does one meet, where does one begin, where does one end, and how do you differentiate Catholicism from your own cultural traditions?
Mm-hmm. There's a way that we've lived with Catholicism for so long, in much of the ways that, for example, in West African countries, let's say Senegal and Mali as examples, the version of Islam that has existed in those spaces, for me, creates they exist almost as indigenous forms because they've become localized. They've become part of the social fabric of those spaces. So the way that the formation of the Murid brotherhoods, and how Sufism functions within a space like Senegal, it's very Senegalese. There's something that identifies it as being, even though it is a tradition that would have been imported or had that came to the continent, not indigenous to the continent. Over time, over centuries of it becoming part of the myths, it becomes part of how they then create it and then become how it's no longer this, oh, this is that and this is that. It's one, right? And I feel that is part of the beauty of it, that sense of recognizing the oneness of source, So I remember fondly my grandmother, Yanique, Letitia Francis. She would, in Jamaica, we bury our dead right on the family land. Right? So she would, when she would leave in the mornings to, let's say on a Sunday morning to go to church, and even when she would wake up, she would always salute the tombs in the yard. And by salute, it's something simple. She would say, "Morning, morning," and then she would kind of go into a conversation with all of her ancestors there on the land, her husband, her auntie, different people. And then, you would see her sometimes when she would go to church. So, she would wear a kind of house shoes And then she put her church shoes under her arm, and she have our Bible, her church shoes, a little purse. She's going to the front yard, the front of the walkway now. You have to walk a good little distance to reach the front road. So if she reached the front road, we have a breadfruit tree right there, and she would take off her yard shoes and put on our church shoes to go on the main road. Right? And that seamless action of acknowledging, recognizing, saying, morning, morning, you know, speaking their existence into being, going to church, saying our Father, clapping our hands, saying the Apostles' Creed, her 23rd Psalm, and fill up with the Spirit. She'll come back and she would take off our shoes and put on our yard shoes and walk to the tomb and sometimes sit down on the tomb. And she'll sit down on the tomb and say, Mash, just me come back and have a long thing. She said, let me bring me something to drink now. And she would get the rum and she would pour the rum. This is right after going to church. And for her, there's no confusion. There's no mix up, right? She'd praise our Jesus Christ. And she'd say our Hail Mary. And she said what she need to say. And she'd come back and she'd say, yes, now, Master, let me tell you, this damn picnic that might drive me mad, And she'll go into this conversation and say, and she'll pour him a little rum. She said, let me bring her coffee. She'll bring him a coffee. She'll drink coffee with him as though the two of them are holding space in real time, right? And this is the thing that I wish that we don't lose that, because our ancestors were, not only could they code shift in the way they spoke, they could get spoken and they could speak them language. They also recognized you could shift codes with how you observe the sacred. That the sacred, the modes of which you pay honor to the sacred is wide and expansive, and all of them are sacred. One doesn't take dominance over an next. That's important.
We don't learn that in church or in school.
No, man, I feel you learn that in your yard.
Yeah, but that's why there's this crisis when there is an awakening.
Yeah.
When I see my spirituality in the context of Garifuna spirituality, but at this point, it's all spirit and divine and source. But my main conflict, and that of many of our guests on our show, is the priest and the Bible and my Christian friends told me that spirits don't exist, but this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm hearing. I must be crazy.
But which part you drop from? You drop from where? Where you come from? You don't come from somewhere. Somebody didn't push you out, whether them squat you out, whatever. So you came from someplace, right? And there's a thing where your entry also depended on the entry of that person who gave you light, dando luz.
But we're not supposed to see those who came before us, for those who have that gift.
Well, that's why I say, okay, not everybody could see them. That's right. Not everybody, like my mom passed away, and she don't show herself to me, but she speaks to me, certainly. And we recognize that not everyone has that gift, but it's a logical thing when you recognize that. And that's why I like the Spanish phrase of giving light, in terms of when you're in el parto, when you're giving birth, dando luz. And then that same luz, when you're saying luz y progreso al Espíritu Santo, when you are saying, I wish for your spirit light and progress, that your spirit of when you're doing the novena, and they're doing the 9 nights of prayers to elevate that spirit. They esté dando luz as well. So that's a full cycle. A mother gives light, and those who are living must give light to the deceased so that spirit gets elevated. ¿Cómo ese no está conectada? How can we not see these two realms being connected? You know what I mean? They're like, one is here, but there's a circle that connects the two realms.
I think it comes back to what you said about when you first saw the name and the title of this discussion, where you don't want to just talk about that. You want to talk about the essence of spirituality in general, but that is why I put the name that way, because people tend to want to differentiate or want to put this other on what is indigeneity with spirituality, and then you have this Western thought.
Yeah.
And that is the problem. So we here can sit and talk about spirituality, and we can make those connections through this discussion. But for somebody that is strong in their beliefs, these Western beliefs, I think that it would be a lot more difficult, right? We in this generation alone, where I feel like there is a lot of ways to get educated on these things. There's a lot of places you can read. There's a lot of people that you can talk to, but there is still this ignorance when it comes to something like Vodou, something like indigenous spirituality, and to people want it to be just black and white, right? This is Vodou, so that is evil, and this is Christianity, and that is light, and that's it. And when you try to make these connections, you get crazy. Like what?
Crazy.
And those binaries are not even, they're not useful at all.
They're not real.
Exactly. People like Steph and I live in the gray. Okay, that's where we live. That's where we exist. It's not black and white. There's gray, and there are different shades of gray.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So,
It
And
goes
they're
to what you said
different.
about control, April. It's easier to understand and control things if they're in separate boxes. I'm sorry, Doctor. What to say?
No. It's just that ability, that sense of fluidity, you know. And I think we owe it to our younger people to give them a certain kind of the give them the tools to awaken to different kind of spiritual literacies, where they're able to understand and you know, there I find there usually comes to a point in time of a young person's life where they begin to question and and be curious about, okay, where does this all reside? How, where am I? What am I? Who am I? All of that. And I think it's in those moments that we need to really open them up to the different information that they could source, that there is so many ways that you could come to spirit. You could come to it through meditation. You could come to it through yoga. You could come through it through dance. You could come through it through a whole range, through going to church, going to a synagogue, going to a mosque, figuring out what is all of this. But I think the danger is in thinking that there's only one way to spirit, or that spirit is only one thing, that it's only male, it's only white, it's only blonde, it's only blue-eyed, it's only, I'm like, if God is creating humankind in the likeness of his image, my image look a certain way, that already displaces and destabilizes that, right? And so we need to begin to, let me come again, and let me do this again, and figure out, and so, and it doesn't mean that you can't believe that, but we need to leave room. We need to leave room for space for people to believe other things, and to recognize that there are other ways of knowing, and there's other ways of occupying the world in a just, humane, and spiritual way. That there's not just one way to source, right? And so that I think is what we require to build a certain humanity, to recognize that our shared humanity is in part because we are connected to source. You may call your source, your head, Buddha, right? One might call my head Yahweh, or Jah, or Vishnu, or Krishna, or Lakshmi, right? I might call my Olodumare, or Lofin, or Lorun, might be my head, Yemaya, might be Olokun, might be Papalekba, right? That these are all entities that come into our realm, from different traditions, different trajectories, but all source, which is energetic, you know, which is about the fulfillment of our greatest good. You know, and yeah. Yeah. And I know, you know, I'm often asked, so how do you come to this journey? Right? I'm writing a piece now within the Lukumi tradition. They use the term, which is coming from the Yoruba, derived from the Yoruba um, religion of Nigeria, Southwest Nigeria. They speak of what's known as an asiento, or a seating, or a crowning, cariocha, when you're crowning your orisha, or seating your crown, seating the orisha of which you were born with, who accompanies you on your head. And it's known as a ceremony known as an asiento, or cariocha. And my journey to my seats, to seating my crown, came through my feet. So I often say, I came to my crown through my feet. And what do I mean by that? I came to my crown through my feet is because it was through the dance that I came to a greater awareness of my spiritual path. I was an immigrant in New York. My family had migrated from Jamaica, and we were living in Queens in Rego Park. And I had a Puerto Rican neighbor just in front of me. I had a Haitian neighbor above us. He was on the 6th floor. We were on the 2nd floor. I had there were people from Hasidic Jews in the neighborhood. It was a real blend, you know. So I came to understand. You know, I went to my bar mitzvahs and visited friends and went to Sinai, had my Seder and experienced Passover, and then I would experience Fête Lua, and I would experience, you know, Dia de los Muertos with a friend from Mexico. And it was a real interesting amalgamation of cultures from around, all of us immigrants living in this space with our various traditions. And I went to Catholic church. And among many, all of the neighborhood immigrant kids went to Catholic church. No matter where they came from, they were Baptist. We all went to the same Catholic church. And it was a space that was so enlightening because I understood the pantheon of divinities. So when my neighbor, Valérie Chamberlain from Haiti, had her Lua and was speaking of Dambala, and I said, oh, that's St. Patrick. I was able to make those connections with the chromiolithograph she had in her home. And we went to the same church and we spoke the same language, base, even though they were layered with all these other traditions. Lola, who lived in front from Puerto Rico, had these incredible altars for Catholic saints, but behind them she was speaking something else that wasn't Catholic litanies. She was, you know, praying to Shango and to Oya and to Yamaya. And I was like, in my head was like blown open, like, whoa, this universe. But then it was in a dance class, because here I was at 13 and I would take a trip to the village where Baba Richard Gonzalez from Puerto Rico was teaching Orisha dances. And when those drums started, it was like something in me just went, and my curiosity was piqued through that connection, that ancestral connection to rhythm, to sound, that sonic scape that opened up this world. So I didn't enter into the spiritual path through books. I entered it through the body, through music, through dancing, and feeling all that was doing to my insides. That sense of feeling like this displaced person. They would call me banana boat picnic, you know, because at that time it wasn't cool to be from the Caribbean and living in New York, you know. And here But in that space of in this dance class, I was able to find spirit and align myself and find a sense of belonging. And it was through the singing, para su ayo, o Moriana wana mama que mira we, oh barawa oh, and those songs, right? Singing it and feeling it in my body. Ache mo yuba orisha, mo yuba o, mo yuba orisha, and finding that gesture through sound, music. But I was like, well, who is Eshu Legbara? And I would went curiously trying to find, and it was through that trajectory. It was like, through dancing with them time and time again, learning the songs, even not speaking the language, but learning the songs and being encouraged to go and being in community. So it was through my feet that less than, so this would have started from 13. And by the time I was 18, I had my first set of initiation stuff. Right? And then another almost 10 years for another round, and then another round, and it opened up because it was, it was integrated in that way. And so I'm crowned Yemaya, but I'm a child of Olokun, and Eshu Legbara is my father. And I'm a Madre Nkisi within the Palo Mayombe system of the Bantu. And I was very much grounded in the Kumina traditions of my native Jamaica and the Maroon traditions of my mother's line. So there's a sense that these worlds coincide, right? And I still could do my rosary, and I still say my Hail Marys and my Our Fathers. And for me, it's not conflictual. We're coming into the season of the birth of Christ. And I recognize that season as being holy among holy, but that doesn't disavow that the 4th of December is also the day for Chango Kabiosili, and I could celebrate him there too, through his Catholic syncretic version of Santa Barbara, and so it's being open to spirit, essentially.
So I have to ask, at 18, your first set of initiations, how did your family react? How did they take that?
Did they know?
Did they attend? Were they supportive? Did you have?
They were supportive. They didn't. Some of them they couldn't because they didn't. But the thing is, maybe my family's a little different because my on both sides they are what we would call seers. So I had a lot of seers in my family. Right? We know what we mean by seers: those who have the gift of sight. And so they weren't surprised that it's not something that was foreign to them. What was foreign was that I was trotting in a tradition through another tradition in a language that none of them spoke. But my spirit felt very connected to Cuba. It feels very connected to Haiti. There's some ancestral lineage there as well. And so they were curious about, but they may have thought I would have trod Rastafari because that's there, and there were family members that were Rasta. And while I understood Rasta and I respected deeply, I knew that wasn't my path, right? And so yes, and my mom, as the years went by, my mom developed more of an openness, and so when I had my daughters, the first one, when she was she's now 17, but when she was just about 3 months old, my mom noticed in her what she would call a gift of sight at 3 months. And then I remember she was probably around 3 years old when she described a man that was sitting by the front door. And she kept going to this front door and was talking to the front door. And, maybe any other place they might have taken her into an asylum. But my mom was listening to her, having full conversation and like play dates with with who she was engaging with. And I remember my mom's eyes welled up one day as she realized that she was talking to her father. So my, yeah, who passed away however many, she was only 3. She described him to a T, what he had on, how he wore his pants, how his hand looked. And it was like this. And she said to me, she said, yeah, this one needs to be crowned. And who is she a daughter of? Goddess of death, Yansan, Hikwaye, Oya. And who's her father? Goddess of disease and also an energy of death, Oluopopo Asohano, Baba Luaye, in Catholic known as St. Lazarus. So that energy comes together in her. And so she was initiated at 5. She was initiated very young. And her sister was initiated at 6. And so there, it's also what they come with. It's what you come with. Not everyone comes with that. And it's so I think my mom had a sensitivity. She was afraid of it sometimes. She didn't really, talk about, she was a dreamer. So you would hear everybody would be like, oh Lord, Miss Jem dreaming. So she would tell you like, okay, when she'd dream you and she'll dream friends of mine and she would say, I see you in this dream, and she would be able to decode dreams. So that was her gift. And so I think there was a receptivity to the knowledge that we all carry certain gifts and we all have been blessed by these things. And it's not a curse. These are all blessings that allow us to recognize and fulfill what it is we've come to do. So while she wasn't really there in the first one, she was there definitely in subsequent ones, sometimes more spiritually than otherwise, but her blessing was very much a part of the journey. And sometimes it does take a detachment to reattach, right? There's sometimes it does take kind of what you said, Kylie, that you have to block out the sound. Your mom says you have to, okay, to get to that. So we start where we began. Sometimes you do have to block out the chatter and detach so that you could come back to reattach in a new way and a more evolved way. And you find most sacred journeys are like that. Monks don't just stay in the midst of everything. They remove themselves. They're in the mountains. They're in their monasteries. Rastafari, some mansions within Rastafari remove themselves from Babylon so that they could be in the liberty of nature, right? They go up in the hills, right? So this is not an unusual thing of removing yourself to tap into spirit and then getting that foundational grounding so that you could be reabsorbed anew. You don't come back the same way. You come back better each time, each cycle.
I am just absorbing all of this great energy, but I wanted to kind of I saw, I'm looking at the comments, and a lot of I think a lot of our audience is quiet because this kind of information we don't talk about.
Yeah.
This is not something that people, I don't know if it's because they're afraid of it or if it's just something that they're uncomfortable with. But I know you give classes on this. How do your students react? And maybe like first time students, how do they react to this kind of information?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember the first time I came to teach religion. I was a comparative religion major, so I was always curious about how do you understand world cultures and other people through faith systems, through belief. And so I was curious about learning about other cultures, but I chose world religions to do that. So I did comparative religion and anthropology as a undergraduate. And my teachers, Walter Brenneman, William Payton, and many, I remember them fondly and hope they're still among us. and bow my head to them in deep gratitude for Richard Sugarman, who taught me about Judaism and taught me about how to read the Torah. So I was reading things on Hinduism, on Judaism, and I did my senior thesis on Oya. And my first child is a daughter of Oya, but I did my senior thesis on Oya. And I was remarking that in all of my years of studying in that program, they didn't do anything on African religions, right? And I was like, this is odd, you know. And I didn't critique it hard, but for them, world religion was the Judeo-Christian tradition and Asian religions and Islam. So anything in between just fell through the cracks. And I think I was one of the first theses that looked at an Afro-Atlantic religion. I was looking at Oya as she existed in Brazil and in Cuba and in Nigeria, Nupe land. And so when I teach about religion, I approach it as a philosophy. I don't approach it as belief or faith. I approach it, I go to, there's an anthropologist that I use, some may call it dated, Clifford Geertz. And Clifford Geertz, in his Interpretation of Cultures, a book called The Interpretation of Cultures, has a series of chapters where he says art as a cultural system, and then he has one, religion as a cultural system. And I use that because it frames religion as, when we think about culture, as a way of life, a way of the everyday practice of being, just living, lived reality. It takes away all of that extra baggage that comes with religion, you know? It takes away, so people could enter and like, okay, this is, and when I think about it, I was like, you know, what religion offers is a particular worldview. We all inhabit this world from different positions with different biographies, different experiences. We come from different classes, so our material conditions aren't the same. We occupy different kinds of households. We come from different traditions. And so inevitably, how we understand the world will be different because we come from different trajectories. And so I approach this sense of teaching about religion by introducing students, and I use William Hayden's work on religious worlds because I like this concept of worlds, that we don't just occupy a world, we live in worlds. And so how do we understand this cultural world that people have come to give meaning to? And in a way, religion is what allows people to assign meaning to what is otherwise awesome, what is otherwise goes beyond explanation and you know? And so, like, how do you make sense? Like, why is the sky blue? Like, how do we come to that? Yeah, how did we, you know, come to this sense of the wonderment of the ocean, right? Like, how do we understand it not only as a site of recreation, but also a space, a sacred abode of a divinity? And what does that then do to a person who sees it as a space of the sacred? How do they interact with it? And how we could then understand this concept of living water. So when we say you must be baptized in living water, right? So what is the difference between the tap water and rainwater, river water and sea water, right? So when you begin to think about that, then it's like, oh, that's why they do deep immersion, the spiritual Baptists, in bodies of living water, like John the Baptist, right? How do we make, and so certain worlds that might otherwise seem untouchable become more, it's like, oh yeah, I get that. Okay, yeah. And you break it down into those elements and it makes it less, you know, I don't at all go into the esoteric stuff because that's a deep order of things that you don't, if you're not there, you're not there. And you don't need to be there to understand um, the structure of what makes it all come together, right? And so if you approach it from that space of religion being a way in which people make sense of the world in which they live in and give meaning to that world and inhabit that world and share that world with others, I think that entry allows for a space to then inch by inch incorporate other things. Um, Whether it then we move into cosmology, what is this notion of cosmos, right? That not everyone have a heaven or hell. There's other ways that we could perceive and conceive of this cosmos. Where do we place this notion of the cycle of life? Like, why do all these, I do a lot of work on mortuary rites. And one of my last book was on Caribbean ways of mourning and funerary customs. And I'm working on one now on wake dances. And it's like, why wake dances? And I'm like, it's that one thing that unifies so many different territories across the broader Black Atlantic. And the idea, that's the one thing you're short about. You don't know when you're going, but you're going, right? And we've developed so many wisdom systems have elaborate understandings of making sense of that moment, right? And within African systems of thought, they're quite expansive of how they perceive of that moment of transition. And the terminology that is used, passing, crossing, transitioning, seldom do you hear death, because death as a concept is too finite. The word, rather, not as a concept, the word is finite. But when we think of journey, oh man, we could be traveling for a while, And so when we begin to also the importance of using the language that the system of which you're exploring uses, VOODOO has no resonance to what people in Haiti practice. So if you come in there saying, we're going to learn voodoo, and they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. That isn't what we do. We don't do voodoo. We serve the spirits, right? And so if you are coming in with a set of vocabulary and concepts that are not in alignment with what you are trying to study, right? So Rastafari, they don't deal with isms and schisms. So I'm not going to say, today we're going to talk about Rastafarianism. Rastas don't use ism. So why would you use that and propagate that to talk about something if you're going to be talking about it with respect? So it's like Rastafari. And it's okay if the English is saying, well, it really should be ism. No, it doesn't have to be. You're putting that there, right? And when they're saying you can't be oppressing, you're down pressing. And you use the language to recognize that many of these cultures and systems have already named. They know what it is they are speaking about, and they name their reality. And the first order of engagement has to be in the language of which they offer you, not in the language of which you wish to share it to the world. So you can't come in with a veneer of something else to actually give space for that reality to be expressed. You use the language of which they speak, and there's certain, like I wouldn't say knowledge for connaissance, because connaissance as a Haitian concept goes much deeper than knowledge. The English language is it doesn't have enough meaning to capture the depth of meaning that some of these indigenous concepts and words capture.
And like that you use the philosophy though, because when we talk about indigenous spaces and indigenous sacred spaces, or right now we're trying to do a translation from our website into different languages that are in Belize, and we've had amazing volunteers to help us out. We still don't have a Garifuna translator. Wink, wink, someone out there. But my my great volunteer Jeremiah, who did our Mopan translation, said he found it so difficult to translate academic language into his philosophical language that is Mopan, because some certain things are just more than what the English
Yeah,
the
it goes
English language is
beyond
limiting what he wants to say.
yeah.
Mhm.
And the thing about the digital universe, what it offers us is that some things go beyond semantic expression. Some things there's no word for. Some things you have to embody. Some things are best said visually. And so, in creating like a digital archive, being open to the reality that it may not be a word, it may be a sound, it may be an image, and being willing and daring enough for that to be okay. That we don't always have to fit the bill in trying to say, oh, well, we're creating an encyclopedia and an encyclopedia looks like, nah. Especially if we have the technology that allows us to be much more creative in how we bring knowledge to the world, right? Because it is certain times, certain things, it's about a structure of feeling, and sometimes the word cannot capture that feeling. It's an ethos that goes into this notion of sentiment and sometimes sound, right? So when you're at a dugu and you hear that sound, what is it doing? How does it call you? Mm, it's functioning beyond some, there's no word for it, you know? And so how do we incorporate that is where, because that too is its own language. It is its own concept. It's its own philosophy. Whole world get discussed musically, sonically. You know, entire universes get called through the hitting and sounding of the drum. And so, yeah, it's a really it's that's base that's like foundational of where we must come from in
Well,
terms of
you
teaching.
began by saying that Afro-Indigenous spirituality is very expansive, and the Eurocentric way of existing is very restrictive. And for us to translate our Indigenous worldview to the Western one, we must use our Indigenous language and Indigenous way, which is, as you said, expansive. And so including that sound in the video and legitimizing it, because there are those who would say, if it is not an academic paper, it is not academic, it is not legitimate. But it is for us to legitimize the way that we express our. Do you know what I'm trying to say? I've lost my.
Completely. I mean,
Okay.
as in my position as head of a cultural studies department, I'm really pushing for practice-based degrees to recognize that knowledge, we come to knowing in different ways. There's not one way that somebody comes to know. We know and we come to knowledge in different, multiple ways. And if we continually decry the other ways of knowledge is coming to knowledge as being um, being secondary, a secondary order, or not as valid or not legitimate, we do ourselves a disservice because it means that we're closing out a whole set of things. A whole world becomes closed out if we're only dependent on um, narrative structures and there is a place for that to reside, and actually including practice based approaches doesn't diminish the potency of the word. It supplements it, it adds to it, right? And especially when you're coming from cultures of which transmission of knowledge has always been oral or corporal, through the body, through the voice, through the use of the hands. So why wouldn't those systems also be incorporated in the ways that we come to share about these systems, right? So, when I think about Woka, a dance and music genre out of Guadeloupe, I could talk about Woka in like, yeah, it's 7 rhythms, 7 dances, Pajambel, Grage, Les Roses, Volet, and I could name them all, but that means absolutely nothing, right? There has to be like, how do you differentiate a Pajambel from a Grage, from a Les Roses? You do that through hearing it, through embodying it, through dancing it. And of course, you could read it and all the descriptions that accompany it. But the deeper seated knowledge that will never leave you is when you're doing it. That never leaves.
Feeling it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's even with the things about the Apostle Creed, I remember saying it in kind of as a little preparing for communion and then confirmation, because there was a part in the Catholic service that I was doing something that would preface it and that would come at the end of it. And so I remember it because, and I can't tell you when last I've been in the Catholic Church, but but because I went through that physicalizing that, embodying the actions, whether it's kneeling, standing, whatever I was doing in preparation to we believe in one God and all of that. That comes, and it comes like even without even thinking about it, because you embody it, right? And there's a certain, it registers in a deep way because it's in that, it's kinesthetic, it's in the memory, it's in the muscle memory.
There's a question here from one of our viewers, Bronwyn, who asks more about talking about the confusion of millennials. And so it's a very lengthy, we have very lengthy questions from our audience. And I'll just post it here on the screen. It says that I gather from the convo that the realm beyond our realm for the awakened can be a great source of light. What I'm curious about, however, is whether there exists an opposing force and how the newly awakened should deal with that force if encountered. Yeah, that is a good question.
Do you want to touch on this, Pearls? Just begin.
This question is my whole life.
Yeah.
I've come to the conclusion, because that can be a whole other hour conversation, that there is a difference between what should be and what is. And what I have lived and what I've heard from guests on our show and even in this conversation is that we grow up hearing what the world is supposed to be like, what God is supposed to be like, what our experience is supposed to be like. And when we have experiences that are outside of that narrow box, i.e. dreaming, seeing spirits, hearing voices, in my case, I receive songs, there is that feeling of being crazy because you go to the people that you trust and they say, oh, no, but yes. And there must be, as you said, Dr. Hume, at the very beginning, there must be detachment in order to reattach. The confusion, I think, is part of the process.
It is critical to the process.
No way around it. I don't like it. I started our podcast to diminish that part of the process, but apparently, yes.
I always say the only way out is through.
Yeah. And confusion reminds you that you're not in the same place where you began, right? Because a state of confusion, I even say this for my standard academic courses when I'm teaching methods, like research methods, that being confused is a critical state for learning. There has to be a moment where the patterns, the habitual patterns that you've developed over time get thrown into question. And that's what confusion is. It's that what you have come to know and all that you've come to know is now being challenged.
Yes.
And if you don't get to that point of being like, ooh, and it doesn't feel good necessarily. But you need to go through it to get to the other side of it. And having a support system is important. It may, and it may not be your kin or your blood relatives or it may be the creation of another family to help support that, friendships, being in nature, going into spaces of silence and isolation, and getting support by the vibrancy of the natural environment. Sometimes it does take, that's why when I speak about detachment, because if you are around patterns that are triggers for you, it could actually hold back the process if you're not sure of how do you work through those triggers, and not let the triggers be a hindrance, but recognize that this is a trigger. And so you don't give it too much attention, you recognize it, but then you move along because your path is much longer than what is being thrown in as a distraction.
There is another question from the audience that says, it's a long one again. So Chelsea Armstrong says that she'll admit that before this, she's heard about Vodou and she always had negative connotations. And she's been told to stay away or to not have any connections with these practices. And now she's seeing things a little bit more clearly, which is great. So she wants to know, where exactly do you believe this negative belief of Vodou originated? And do you think there are people who use Vodou for evil purposes or not what it's intended for?
I'll start with the end and come forward. I think all sacred systems could be interpreted in and used in ways that aren't for the good of others. You can. It could be manipulated in a way that it could be harmful. That isn't just Vodou or Santeria, or every single one can be used depending on how it is interpreted. Because for some, in the same way that, I don't want to call any one system, but there's the ways of which the interpretation of the word can be liberating for one camp who practice the tradition and oppressive for others. And we find that in terms of how women operate in sacred systems. Like, where do they, especially systems that are inherently patriarchal, right? And that puts them in a position of subservience, of submissiveness. So we find that each system has within it, depending on how it's being interpreted or utilized. The complex system of Vodou it is at its heart a healing system. As I started out saying, it's a system that is based on a concept of a high god known as Bondye, Bondye, Bonjai, the high god. And there is a pantheon of divinities known as Lwa, Lwa. There's also known as Miste, or the mystic spirits, the mysteries. There are the ancestors. You have the sacred twins, Marasa. So there's an entire universe of divine entities that are all there for the singular purpose of making one's existence in this lifetime harmonious and in concert with the intentions of the divine universe for good. These are intended for good. you have to understand the demonization of Vodou cannot be separated or apart from the way of which Haiti is treated generally. You have to recognize that as the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, as a nation that had the audacity to dare to be free and to come to its sense of independence, not on the grounds of being unequal, right? The whole premise behind Haiti's um, independent struggle was the abolition of slavery. It wasn't one or the other. Unlike 1776 in the United States, where you had, independence from England or Great Britain, but that independence was shrouded in a slave system that we see the ramifications of all now in the George Floyds of the world, right? And everything else that sets up this system of disequilibrium and where the base was never whole because the foundation of the base was on inequality and racism and all kinds of other things, including this notion of white supremacy. Within the Haitian worldview and within their struggles for freedom, their protracted um, history and trod to freedom, it was already understand that there was a supremacy of humanity. Antonin Fremin, The Equality of the Races, was writing in the 19th century that there's no black or white, there's an equality of the races. It's on the premise of which he was making an argument that freedom had to be for all, not by one or two or declared, it's for all, writ large. What that did to a asymmetrical structure of power that had at its base a false narrative of the primacy of whiteness, Haiti toppled that, completely turned that on its head, because here you had people who were deemed unfit for self-rule, incapable or incapable of thinking, of strategizing, defeating the greatest army or military force at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte's, military force, and destabilizing that. So what was then taken, one of the many things of which was then used to ostracize and demonize Haiti, was the very thing that gave its people its strength and its vitality and its sense of self. And that was its sacred system. And it was a sacred system that wasn't exclusively African. It was a sacred system that already from its base had incorporated elements that were from the Fon sacred universe of the kingdom of Dahomey, Bantu sacred traditions from the Congo, those two being main forces, along with a bit of the Nago traditions of Nigeria, right? Those meeting the Masonic order that was introduced by the French, meeting the Catholicism introduced by the French, meeting the Amerindian Taino traditions of the indigenous first peoples of that land. So what we know as Vodou is an amalgamation of myriads of ways of which the sacred universe collided under a condition of violence and also under a condition of coming to an understanding of source. But what gets maligned is it's African. Oh, that's this thing, this black magic from Africa and da 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 da. And everything else that Vodou also incorporates is not even recognized or realized how much the Masonic order is in Vodou, right? How much of Catholicism is in Vodou, and how much of Taino indigenous lore is in Vodou. All of that is in there too. But you needed something that was tangible, you meaning the West, needed something that was tangible to set up this opposition that we are these enlightened Christian God-fearing people, and these are these heathen demonic, right? So it sets up this false binary, right, of the way of which people perceive the world. And there was never a desire to understand it. It was like, oh, that's what it is, and yeah. And so even in the question, it was like, yeah, I was taught to stay away from it, to not, and that was part of it. It's set up as everything that was negative, everything that was counter to progress and modernity and all of those things. It became a emblem of fear, a fear that still today rocks most of us from even conceptualizing it as something outside of bad, right? But so the question of when did it start to be treated in this way, from the time that 1st of January 1804, when Saint Domingue became Haiti, and they had a religious structure there that they could then say, oh, this is the source of badness. And the fact of the matter of the revolutionary struggles of that epic revolution starting in a ceremony. So its very history of coming into its nationhood was based on its religiosity, right? So you can't separate the two from the whole. They Haiti is Vodou. Vodou is Haiti, right? And so in hating Haiti, it means you also hate Vodou. And in hating Vodou, it also means you hate Haiti. That's the two. And so this has been that uneasy dance that has been going on, right, for all of these years, you know.
I like that you touched about the Africanness that people separate in Vodou, because Vodou is very different than other Garifuna spirituality traditions. And but whenever we want to talk about something bad, right? Whenever we want to talk about something evil, we will incorporate Vodou, or
Yeah,
we'll say Obia, or we say this bad thing.
that's
Um, yeah, and that leads to this next question about African religious beliefs, right? Because it says that it's Lorna Benson asks, why is African religious beliefs not widely accepted or respected, like other religious beliefs and practices, and why is it taught that African ways of spirituality was wrong? Where, I
you
mean,
have
that, I think
you
you
have
kind of answered the question a little bit, but it kind of
to,
taps into that. Yeah.
but you also have to understand that when you colonialism and slavery had to be justified, there had to come up with, why is it that we somehow are the chosen ones, right? Who made us the chosen ones? When we hear Kipling's work on and the poem "The White Man's Burden," right? This idea of the heart of Conrad's heart of darkness. All of this narrative, this racist narrative that spoke of that colonialism and slavery and these structures of asymmetries of power were needed to be exercised to exploit these heathens and bring them to the light. You need to set up that kind of that opposite, right? And so in the inculcation of, in the kind of indoctrination of Africans in the New World, into their new lives here, it meant that they were inundated with this information. So some managed to maintain a space where were able to trod the line but still hold on to the memory of the primacy of who they were. And some weren't as successful and passed that on. And part of the thing about when we think about mental slavery, it's even more damning and damaging than physical, being physically in bondage. Because when you're mentally in bondage, you pass that stuff on generation after generation after generation after generation. That cycle is harder to break, right? But it isn't a habitual pattern of saying, oh, that's some Obia business, that's some Vodou business. And we ourselves have to catch ourselves. Millennials need to catch themselves that it's not okay to say, oh, that's some Vodou stuff, because it's not only dismissive, it also casts these traditions as somehow illegitimate and somehow negative and somehow, and we can't pass it off as jest or something we say in passing or something funny, because it's not. These are life ways that many a people had to die for to even sustain, right? They were the balm, the salve. When I think about, driving through the countryside of Jamaica and seeing, just remembering the whole history of barnyards, healing centers that African peoples would go to in place of a doctor. They would go to healing centers, barnyards, and be prayed over and be washed and be healed, right? And so many of these traditions were the balm for the soul for these communities. And that's why I think I focus so much on mortuary customs, because that's the one place where we still see some of those traditions exist in a way that people don't disregard as, oh, that's foolishness. We recognize that in one's passing, we must pay honor and homage to the ancestral realm to ensure that they get ushered to the other side properly. And recognizing that the language that we inherited, some of the traditions that we inherited, are not enough, right? That we need to find those other ways of knowing to help our people transition,
I'm so sorry to cut you short, Dr. Hume, but
it's fine.
we're like 45 minutes over the time. I could sit here and listen to you forever. And I think that everyone in the audience, as well as Kylie and Ferosa, feel the exact same way. It's been such an eye-opening discussion. And I think we should have a part 2. Tell us in the link below if you want a part 2. Just put it in there. But yes, I want to first ask if you would be willing to close us off with a prayer. And before we say goodbye to our audience, I'd like to thank each of you on behalf of all of us here at Heritage Education Network Belize for being here, for having this discussion that I think was very much needed. I didn't realize how much I needed it until I got here. And I think that Ferosa and Kylie would like to do their own interview of you at some point. Am I okay to throw that in there?
I was just about to say that, but I'm glad you said it first, because I wasn't sure if that was something I was supposed to say. So
no, you guys, we are all a family here at Henby, and we're willing to share everything. But I am so happy to have been a part of this, and so happy to have had these wonderful ladies be a part of this as well. I think that we do need more of this kind of conversation. I think that people need it. They don't want to ask for it, but just by listening to you guys talk about, I'm so zenned out. I don't even want to go to my next meeting right now. I'm very I'm very happy to have had all of you here. Relicia wants us to know if we're going to do a series. I don't know, but you can
Alicia,
Please, please go and find Garifuna Sistas
yes.
Spirituality. We literally have these conversations every other week,
Mm-hmm.
every week in November, but with the lens of Garifuna Ness. But honestly, the lessons and the stories are transferable across cultures. We talk about
Yes.
spirituality. We talk about that confusion because we are
Mhm.
searching. We are returning, and in the process of returning, there is a shedding of
Yes.
what is not ours.
Right. Yes, I was gonna say, listen to them. They have about 23
Our next
interviews.
episode comes out on Sunday. Please, find us on Instagram, Apple
Yeah.
Podcasts, Spotify.
I think that in every indigenous or African spirituality, belief, philosophy, um, search, you're going to find Dr. Yanique Hume in there. You're going to just read all of her articles and read all of her books and all of her publications. It's really and truly just inspiring. And I am just extremely happy with so much gratitude to be in this space with all of you. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being here. And I will now pass the floor on to Dr. Hume to close us off. Thank you.
well, I would like to share this moment with the Kaitano sisters, Garifuna sisters, in honor for those that spiritual family to be present. I would begin by just stating we call on the energies of the cardinal points of the four winds of the north, the south, the east, and the west. To those spiritual energies that occupy that celestial realm above us, and those that occupy the terrestrial realm, and those that dwell in the marshy underwater land and universe of Kalinga, to the spirits who have already made their trek back to Guinea, to those who've traversed the bottom of the ocean floor and have found their way home. We thank you for joining us, for holding space with us, for the lessons, for the honoring, for the space that is created to bring you to light, to continue to elevate your your energy, to continue to elevate the teachings of which you leave with us. We recognize that presence, and we ask that as you return to where you have entered from, that you keep all of us in your hearts. You keep illuminating our path so that we can always remember the divine purpose that we all have. That our own trek and our own path is one that is built on practice, one that is built on community, one that is built on collective engagements, and one that is built on heart, spirit guide, divine guidance always. That's it.
Itarala.
Ceremony. Thank you.